Welcome to the second talk for week 5 of our course, Transmission of the Light. This chapter is on Eihei Dogen. Dogen Zenji. Zenji just means Zen master. And as you all know already, Dogen was the founder of Soto Zen, of the lineage, a particular branch of Zen Buddhism, for which this text was created. And so he's one of the more important figures in the text. And so starting with the Cleary translation, Dogen studied with Zen master Rujing. So Dogen was born in Japan in the year 1200, and he was a very cheeky young monk. And we'll say a little bit more about his training in a minute, but in any event, he went to China in the hopes of finding a teacher, and there he encountered Zen Master Rujing, who became his teacher. And so once during the late night sit, Rujing said, "Zen study is the shedding of body and mind," or the official Sotoshu translation says the sloughing off of body and mind, the sloughing off. Or it's often also called the dropping off body and mind. Hearing this, Dogen was suddenly enlightened. He went to the abbot's room and lit incense. And Rujing, the abbot, said, "What are you doing?" And Dogen said, "Body and mind have been shed." Rujing replied, "Body and mind shed body and mind." And Dogen said, "Oh, this is just a temporary byway. This is just a momentary insight. Don't approve me too quickly." And Rujing said, "I'm not." And so I just want to pause here and say that although I haven't seen this interpretation echoed in other places, my understanding of what happened right there was that Dogen came in and said, "Body and mind have dropped off." And Rujing replied with another step. "Okay, that's happened." And then the next step is body and mind dropped off body and mind. So something about going still further to having relinquished even that idea, even that experience, to have surrendered to the totality of Buddha nature. And Dogen didn't catch it right then. That's why he says, "Don't approve me too quickly." And Rujing says, "I'm not approving you. I'm actually," he didn't say this next part, but what I believe was happening was he was actually giving him an instruction. And so then Dogen gets it, because he asked the question, what is that which isn't given arbitrary approval? In other words, what is it that you were pointing at with that next step? And Rujing says, shedding body and mind. So, in other words, yet another sloughing off that happens. And Dogen bowed, and then there was the approval from Rujing. The shedding is shed. The sloughing off has been sloughed off. In other words, the you has gone out of it. The self has been relinquished and surrendered over to that which is beyond the body and mind. So then we hear a little bit about Dogen He was sort of distant Japanese royalty. He was from an upper class family, and he was known to be sort of precocious, or he was thought of as a prodigy from the very beginning. His mother died when he was 8. I don't know if that's 8 by Japanese counting or 8 by Western counting. 8 by Japanese counting would be the equivalent of 7 by Western counting. But nonetheless, his mother died when he was quite young, and he was very moved by this. He was very, very deeply touched by the loss and understanding the impermanence of it. It's said that we see later in the chapter actually that he watched the smoke rising up from his mother's funeral pyre when she was being cremated, and was very moved by that and the meaning of it. And he learned to read Chinese from his grandmother very, very young, very early in life. That could turn out to be quite useful tool, not only because in Japanese culture, Japanese society, they would have been very highly valued, but also because of his later travels and study of Buddhism that had come from China. So that was very, very helpful. And I would say fairly typical of an upper class, a family associated with upper class society in Japan at that time. Chinese culture is very highly valued. In any event, yes, so then we get to the smoke rising. He studied Vasubandhu. So Vasubandhu is a very well-known Indian master, Buddhist master, and he is known for having developed the Yogacara school. The Yogacara school, often called the mind-only school. But Dogen was not a mind-only teacher by any stretch of the imagination, I don't think, and neither was Keizan Zenji, as we'll see in just a moment. But he studied the Abhidhammakosha, and that's kind of interesting that he had an interest, is basically demonstrating, or Keizan's attempt to demonstrate that Dogen was very widely studied across different kinds of Buddhism. And so, having been part of that family that he was born into, there was his uncle, I believe, who was going to help him, or actually his adopted dad, which I think was his uncle actually, but was going to have him become part of Japanese government, political affairs, but Dogen ran off to Mount Hiei instead and became a Tendai monk. So Tendai Buddhism is a Vajrayana form of Buddhism. It is Buddhism that had arrived, obviously, in Japan before Zen, and it had evolved its particular Japanese Vajrayana flavor by the time Dogen would have been practicing in it. But he still had a lot of questions, and he felt very unresolved. And I imagine that he was a very precocious young man who seemed, from what we can tell of him these days, to have been quite intelligent and well-studied and quite insistent in getting an answer. But he wasn't getting an answer that resolved his dukkha, resolved his quest in the Tendai school. So they sent him to Eisai, but he ended up becoming the successor of Myozen, who is Eisai's successor, at Kenninji. And So that means that he was a Rinzai Zen monk already before he founded the Soto school or brought the Soto style of Zen from China later. So he did quite a bit of, you could say, search within Buddhist traditions for something that would help him to realize the way completely. And so he did receive transmission in the Rinzai school. And then there's this question. So he went to China. He took a boat over to China, and he had many dialogues there that are recorded, many very fascinating dialogues. But this one that's recorded here with Rutan is just classic Dogen, I believe. I'm glad that Keizan shared it with us. So he had arrived in China just 4 months earlier. He was in his 20s and early 20s. And he said, "Did you come this way with a group?" And he said, "Well, how about if I didn't come this way with a group?" But then Rutan says, "This is still coming this way following a group." In other words, just doing the opposite of what everyone is doing is also being subject to what everyone is doing. So that probably landed with Dogen at that time. And so he says, okay, well, then what's right? But Rutan just hits him and says, "You're just very talkative young man." In other words, don't demand that I just give you the answer. Work it out for yourself. So eventually Rutan invites him to just stay for tea. And on it goes. Dogen saw Sicho and basically flunked him. So you can see that he's getting quite arrogant. He's over the years, he has developed a very strong intellectual sense of practice, and it's given him a bit of a big head, and that's problematic. And that actually is what drives him away from Japan to China, and in China to visit many, many people and try to suss some things out. So, and Keizan also reminds us here that he became very conceited, quote unquote, at the bottom of the 198 in the Cleary translation. But when he was sent to Ruzheng, Zen master, Chan master Ruzheng, and Ruzheng at the very outset blunted his attack, or broke his spear point, is the literal translation that the Soto Shu folks gave. So in other words, whatever was that first encounter with Ruzheng showed him that it was not a matter of wordplay, that there was something that he had deeply experienced and understood, and that he had something to teach Dogen. And so Dogen became his student and wrote him this very, very sincere letter, which is recounted here. "I pray that in your great compassion you will allow a foreigner, an insignificant man from a distant place, to freely come to your room to ask about the teaching." So he really, really wants a relationship. He really wants to be able to be met in his search in this very personal way with Ruzheng. And Ruzheng grants him that privilege. And in fact, he was going to make him his attendant so that he would have that privilege night and day. But Dogen, very interestingly, sort of works his way out of that. And he says, well, it would be a problem actually for the monastery if I were to become your attendant. And most likely that's correct. He would not have understood the subtleties of Chinese culture, of Chinese language, of even monastic culture as it was being lived at Ruzheng's monastery and Tiantong. And nonetheless, it's also very convenient for him that he doesn't take on that responsibility and he can just practice as one of the regular monks. So then there is that awakening moment, right? Ruzheng says to study Zen is dropping off body and mind. And that breaks open the mass of doubt for Dogen and resolves some issue for him, very deeply results in some experience. So he goes on to pay respects to the succession documents of various teachers in all the 5 schools of Zen. I see this is a very classical Dogen. He was a person seemingly of great formality. The rules and the specificity of ceremonial ritual life in Soto Zen and the way that he set up the relationships has a great deal of formality to it, and so I can understand why this would have been important to him, particularly because he also wanted to not disrespect Myozen. Myozen was very, very deeply meaningful teacher to him, and Myozen, rather, sorry, was a very, very deeply meaningful teacher to him, and he mentions Myozen and his debt of gratitude to him in various writings of his own. Dogen does later on. So there was a strong, the value, the practice value that is being upheld here for us is something about working skillfully with doubt, not being overcome by the doubt, but allowing the doubt to be a motivator, something that keeps you engaged, something that fuels your passion, your energy, your interest in the Dhamma, all the way to the end. This is the kind of practice that is being described when we hear about Dogen's life before his return to Japan to found the Zen school, the Soto Zen school. So he does, however, come back to Japan. After only a very short time in China. He's there, gosh, I want to say like about 2 years, maybe 4 years at the max. It was a very short time in China. But then we get to the end of this chapter and we have a very interesting teaching from Keizan Zenji about the meaning of this phrase, dropping off body and mind, and what's meant by mind. And I want to say right off the bat that this is Keizan Zenji's personal understanding. This is not the way that it's understood in early Buddhism. It's not the way that it's described in Yogacara. This is Keizan Zenji's particular personal understanding of mind. So what he says is, he says, people think that there are 2 kinds of mind, and I'm not going to go into what those 2 are because it doesn't make sense, because then he goes on to say that there are 3, but then actually what he describes are 4. So what's happening here? So Keizan says that there is consciousness which represents likes and unlikes. So now again, we're working with the translators' words, what the translators are understanding from the kanji characters, the Japanese characters that are used by Keizan or perhaps by Keizan's student to write this down. Most likely by Keizan's student and not Keizan himself. So we see in detail, there's a 3-fold distinction. Now I'm reading from the Cleary 201, page 201, although the Cook is also a very good translation. We'll look at both. 3-fold distinction: mind, cognition, or thought is the way that Sotoshu translates it, and consciousness. And again, we just need to drop all of our previous ideas about what those terms mean in other traditions and just have a look here at what Keizan is proposing. So Keizan Zenji is saying, consciousness is the mind that likes and dislikes, affirms and denies, approves and disapproves. So it is a mind of active discrimination. Of active discrimination. It is a mind that is having responses and reactions and volition and so on to what's perceived. Then cognition, or let's see what Cook used. I think Cook also used thought there, but let's have a look quickly. Thought, right? So Cook and the Sotoshu both use thought for this second aspect. So thought discerns distinctions such as coolness and warmth, pain and itch. So still a discriminating or still a discriminating aspect of the mind, a discerning aspect, a dualistic aspect of the mind, but one that is closer to the basic perceptions, just the coolness or the warmth of a thing, a pain or an itch. So something that's not quite at the level of approving and disapproving, right? Having a story or a reaction or a volition toward whatever it is that's being perceived. So thought is discerning the distinctions that are more basic, you could say, according again to Keizan. And then we have mind. Mind doesn't distinguish right or wrong or pain or itch. It is like a wall, like a stone, still and silent, has no ears and no eyes. Like an iron mannequin, or a wood mannequin, a wood, statue of a person. Though having eyes you don't see, though having ears you don't hear. But then he says, don't consider that to be original mind. So that's kind of interesting, because to me then what that sounds like is that sounds like the field in which thought is arising, the kind of basic awareness, the kind of awareness, aware mind, the kind of concentrated, very still, very quiet mind, which is removed from sense experience. So to me, that sounds very much like immersion or absorption or concentration, very, very still mind that is not discerning the distinctions of the physical world. But he says, even that's not, quote unquote, original mind, or mind with a capital M, is how the Sotoshu makes that distinction. And let's see, what did Cook do? Yeah, he also uses mind with a capital M, and he calls it fundamental mind. Don't mistake that thing for fundamental mind. Okay. So then what? So we say that the study of the way, we, meaning Keizan as representing Soto Zen, say that the study of the way of Buddhism, the path, must be apart from all three of those prior kinds of mind that he described: mind, cognition, and consciousness, mind, thought, and consciousness. There is beyond those a spiritual light that is eternal and stable. If you observe carefully, you will see it. If you clarify the mind, that mind, there is no mind or body to be found, no things or self accompanying it. That is why it's said that body and mind are shed. You do not find a particle of anything. There is nothing to divide into mind or cognition or consciousness. So now what are we hearing? Let's see if we have Cook's translation here, just to hammer this point home a bit. Learning the way, or perhaps oftentimes it's called attaining the way, realizing the way, is apart from mind, thought, and consciousness. There's this wonderful brightness that is eternally unmoving. If you look carefully, you will certainly reach it. So I would be careful with that statement, because there's a lot of you in that statement, and it's the idea that there's even an observation, again, is very, very, we have to be extremely careful. There's some knowing that's possible, but it's gone beyond the sense of looking, gone beyond the sense of all body or mind of this person. So what does that sound like to me? That sounds like the experience of Nibbana. There's nothing that can be distinguished. There is nothing that can be divided. There is not a particle of anything. There is not a sense of observing. There is not a sense of feeling or touching or having a response or reaction. All of that has been dropped away. All of that has been dropped away. And it's eternal. Why? It's not eternal in the sense, so we have to be very careful, because oftentimes in Zen, you can start to hear this essentialism that can creep in. This defining Buddha nature, or defining an experience, or defining aspects of experience as things that are eternal, that are permanent, that are always present, that are the essence of a person or the essence of all things. And we need to be very, very careful not to take that to mean a kind of essentialism, not to take that to mean, because it starts to approach the soul, the idea of the idea of the soul or God, or again, some sort of essential thing or essential energy or activity, which is always true, rather than a dynamic, moving, empty, conditional, fleeting, non-separate bundle, if you will, of all of reality. So this description that Keizan gives, again, to me, of going to fundamental mind, should be careful not to presume that that means that there's some kind of universal consciousness or essential permanent consciousness. It's eternal in the sense that we cannot distinguish time when there is no us, first of all, that is experiencing Nibbana. This body and mind does somehow know, and yet it is beyond this personal mind. And so if there's not this one knowing and comparing and seeing the differences, as we talked about earlier, then there's no way to tell time either. And it feels like that kind of experience where the sense of the observer is dropped off. It is most definitely timeless. It is most definitely not held in a container of moving forward in time. It's not like that. Okay, so Keizan finally says, when you see, there is not a single thing, he says, quoting, it has been said. I'm not sure whose quote that is. Perhaps it's just him. Having reached this point, Dogen expressed it by saying he'd shed body and mind. And then finally, he, meaning Wu Jing, said, shedding is shed. Even the activity of arriving at any kind of still, quiet consciousness that is not experiencing the physical presence is also dropped off, is also relinquished. Mm. Having reached this state, you are like the bottomless basket or the bottom falling out of the bucket. So the bottom falling out of the bucket is a very common sentiment in Zen. I believe that it actually has to do with the awakening story of a woman who had been a slave. Am I getting this right? I'll have to go back and look for the reference, but it's a very common reference of that sense of everything dropping off. And I want to just really again encourage thinking about this in terms of a surrender. There's a surrender of the sense of self, of the sense of discrimination, of even the sense of a consciousness or an awareness. I liken it to, I used to sometimes sit with my coffee cup in my hand if I was on retreat and I was just kind of sitting all day long, and so I would just kind of fall into a meditation while I still had my coffee cup in my hand, and I could do that and be mindful and be holding the coffee cup. But at some point, there would come a point of release within the meditation where I would either drop the cup or I would have had to have put it down by then, because otherwise there isn't there isn't a possibility of attending to that anymore. So it's that kind of surrender to a much greater degree. In fact, to the complete degree. Mm. So we have this final poem from Keizan. Clear as pure light, no inside or outside, right? Nothing that can be discerned as being my inner world or my outer world, or any interface between those, or discernment or experience of them, none of that. Clear as pure light, no inside or outside. Is there any body or mind to be shed at all? Mm. Mm. How could this human life be limited to a body and mind?